My daughter-in-law Vanessa pushed away the plate of homemade empanadas I'd spent hours preparing, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she said, "I'm sorry, but I just can't eat food made in a housekeeper's kitchen." Her words hung in, the air between us sharp and cold. My son Richard looked down at his own plate, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on my dining table. Neither of them knew that 30 years before I became their children's beloved grandmother, I had cleaned houses for families just like theirs to put myself through nursing school. 1 month later, Vanessa called me at 2 a.m., sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. The journey between those two moments would change both our lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration. My son Richard had just been promoted to senior partner at his law firm, and I had invited him and Vanessa to my home for a special meal. I'd spent days planning the menu, selecting recipes that showcased my Colombian heritage, dishes my mother had taught me, that I had taught Richard, that I hoped someday to teach my grandchildren. My home isn't extravagant. It's a modest 3-bedroom, in a middle-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta, paid for with decades of careful saving from my nursing career. The kitchen has outdated appliances and laminate countertops I've been meaning to replace. But it's clean, it's mine, and until that evening, I had always felt proud to welcome family into it. I'd set the table with my best dishes, the hand-painted set my late husband Antonio had given me for our 20th anniversary. Fresh flowers from my garden formed a centerpiece, and I'd even found candles in the exact shade of blue that Vanessa had chosen for their wedding last year. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. Richard arrived first, wrapping me in a bear hug that lifted me off my feet. At 35, he still had the same warm smile that had melted my heart when he was a toddler, though now it was framed by carefully trimmed stubble and faint lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours at the office. "It smells amazing in here, Mom," he said, bending to kiss my cheek. "What did you make?" "Empanadas to start," I told him. "Then pernil asado, arroz con gandules, and tres leches cake for dessert." His eyes lit up, just like Grandma Elena used to make. "Vanessa's going to love it." I wasn't so sure. In the year since Richard had married Vanessa, I had met her exactly 7 times. Each encounter had been pleasant on the surface, but underlaid with a tension I couldn't quite identify. She was unfailingly polite, complimenting my home and accepting my embraces. But there was always something reserved in her manner, as if she were holding herself slightly apart. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later, impeccably dressed in a cream silk blouse and tailored slacks that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her dark hair was swept into a perfect chignon, not a strand out of place despite the humid Georgia evening. She air-kissed my cheeks and handed me a bottle of wine that I immediately recognized as far too expensive for the occasion. "Carmen? Thank you for having us," she said, her voice carrying the polished accent of someone educated at expensive private schools. "Richard hasn't stopped talking about your cooking." I led them to the dining room, where I'd already set out the empanadas and a homemade chimichurri sauce. Richard immediately reached for one, biting into it with an appreciative groan. "Mom, these are even better than I remember," he mumbled through a mouthful of pastry. Vanessa, however, hesitated. She glanced around my dining room, her gaze lingering on the family photos on the wall. Richard's graduation from law school, Antonio and me on our wedding day, a faded photograph of my parents standing in front of the small grocery store they had owned in Bogotá before immigrating to America. "Everything looks lovely," she said, her fingers toying with the stem of her water glass. "Did you make all this yourself?" "Every bit," I said proudly. "These are recipes passed down through generations. My mother taught me to fold empanadas when I was just a little girl, barely tall enough to reach the counter." She nodded, still not reaching for the food. "And your help? Did they assist with the preparation?" The question caught me off guard. My help? I don't have any help, dear. It's just me in this house since Antonio passed. A small crease appeared between her perfectly arched eyebrows. Oh, I just assumed. When Richard mentioned you lived in this neighborhood, I thought surely you must have someone who comes in, at least for the heavy cleaning. Richard set down his empanada, shooting his wife a warning look that she either didn't notice or chose to ignore. No need, I said lightly, though I could feel something tightening in my chest. I've always preferred to take care of my own home. Vanessa finally picked up an empanada, holding it delicately between manicured fingertips. It's just that someone in your profession must be so busy, and at your age, it must be difficult to maintain everything properly. My age? I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. At 63, I was far from decrepit. I still worked 3 shifts a week at the hospital, tended my garden daily, and took water aerobics classes that left women 20 years my junior gasping for breath. Richard cleared his throat. Mom's the most energetic person I know, Van. Remember I told you she ran that 5K for the hospital fundraiser last month? Vanessa set the empanada back on her plate without taking a bite. Yes, of course. I just worry about sanitation, that's all, especially with food preparation. The room suddenly felt very still. I looked at my daughter-in-law, this beautiful, immaculate woman whom my son adored, and tried to understand what she was really saying. My kitchen is clean, Vanessa. I assure you. She reached for her water glass, taking a small sip before responding. I'm sure you do your best. It's just, I have a very sensitive system. My mother always emphasized the importance of knowing exactly where your food comes from and who has handled it. And then she said it, the words that would echo in my mind for weeks afterward. I'm sorry, but I just can't eat food made in a housekeeper's kitchen. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. A housekeeper's kitchen? This is my home, Vanessa. Yes, but... She gestured vaguely at our surroundings. You understand what I mean. It's different from what I'm accustomed to. My family has always employed a full kitchen staff who are professionally trained in proper food handling. It's not a reflection on you personally. But it was. It absolutely was. Richard stared at his wife, his face flushing with what I hoped was embarrassment on her behalf. Vanessa, that's completely out of line. Apologize to my mother. She turned to him, genuinely surprised by his reaction. I'm simply being honest about my concerns. There's nothing wrong with having standards. I stood up from the table, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. Decades of nursing had taught me to maintain composure in crisis situations, and I drew on that training now. I think I need to check on the main course, I said, my voice remarkably steady given the storm brewing inside me. In the kitchen, I pressed my palms against the cool countertop and took several deep breaths. Through the doorway, I could hear Richard and Vanessa arguing in hushed, intense tones. I caught fragments. Can't believe you would say something so elitist? And don't understand why you're overreacting. Part of me wanted to throw them both out of my house. But a deeper part, the part that had survived leaving my homeland at 19 with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, that had scrubbed toilets and changed beds in strangers' homes to pay for my education, that had held the hands of countless dying patients with dignity and compassion. That part knew this moment called for something more than anger. When I returned to the dining room, carrying the pernil asado on my best serving platter, Richard and Vanessa had lapsed into uncomfortable silence. My son looked up at me, his eyes pleading for guidance on how to proceed. Vanessa, I said calmly, setting down the platter. There's something you should know about me. She straightened in her chair, chin lifting slightly as if preparing for confrontation. Before I became a nurse, before Richard was born, I worked as a housekeeper for 5 years. Her perfectly composed expression faltered. Beside her, Richard's eyes widened in surprise. Though I had never hidden this part of my past, I rarely spoke of it, and he had been too young to remember those early struggling years. I cleaned other people's homes 6 days a week while studying nursing at night, I continued. I scrubbed floors and toilets, changed sheets, dusted bookshelves filled with volumes in English I could barely read at the time. I prepared meals, in kitchens far grander than mine, for families who sometimes didn't even look at me as I served them. Vanessa's cheeks had flushed a deep pink. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. One of those families paid for my textbooks when they learned what I was studying. Another taught me English pronunciation after dinner, correcting me patiently until I lost enough of my accent to be understood easily by patients. Not all of them were kind, but some saw me, really saw me, as a person with dreams and dignity. I picked up the carving knife and began slicing the roast pork, its rich aroma filling the tense air between us. So you see, my dear, when you refuse to eat food prepared in a housekeeper's kitchen, you are refusing food prepared by hands very much like mine. Richard reached across the table and covered my free hand with his own. Mom, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell me? There was never any reason to be ashamed, I said simply, and never any reason to boast about it either. It was honest. Work that helped me become who I am today. Vanessa sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on her empty plate. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. I should go, she said quietly. Richard, I'll call a car. My son started to protest, but I shook my head slightly. Some situations need space more than they need immediate resolution. After they left, Richard with a fierce hug and whispered, Apologies, Vanessa, with a stiff nod and averted eyes. I sat alone at my carefully set table. The food grew cold as I contemplated the evening's disaster and wondered what it would mean for my relationship with my son and his wife going forward. What I couldn't possibly know then was that this painful dinner was actually the beginning of something unexpected. That sometimes the most profound connections grow from moments of terrible misunderstanding. And that exactly 1 month later, my phone would ring in the middle of the night, bringing Vanessa's tearful voice and the first step toward healing the divide between us. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The week following the disastrous dinner passed without a word from either Richard or Vanessa. Each evening I found myself checking my phone more frequently than usual, hoping for a text or missed call. None came. The silence was unlike Richard, who typically called at least twice a week, usually during his drive home from the office when he could speak freely. I tried to occupy myself with my normal routines, morning shifts at the hospital, tending to my garden, weekly coffee with my friends from the nursing staff. But the encounter with Vanessa lingered like a persistent shadow, coloring even the most mundane activities. As I weeded my tomato plants, I found myself replaying her words, searching for some nuance I might have missed. Perhaps I had overreacted. Perhaps I had misunderstood. But no. I just can't eat food made in a housekeeper's kitchen. The words were unambiguous, as was the disdain that had accompanied them. On the 8th day of silence, I was organizing the linen closet, a task I'd been postponing for months when my phone finally rang. My heart jumped when I saw Richard's name on the screen. Mom? His voice sounded strained. Are you busy? Never too busy for you, mijo, I said, settling onto the edge of my bed. How are you? He hesitated. I'm calling to apologize for last week and for not calling sooner. Things have been complicated here. I understand. And I did. Marriage creates its own gravity, pulling you toward your spouse even when they've behaved poorly. I had experienced this myself in the early years with Antonio. How is Vanessa? He sighed heavily. That's part of why I'm calling. She's not great. We've been arguing ever since the dinner. I've never seen her like this. A twinge of guilt surprised me. Despite my hurt feelings, I took no pleasure in causing friction between my son and his wife. I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can do? Actually, yes. His tone brightened slightly. I was hoping you might be willing to try again. Maybe we could come over this Sunday. I think if Vanessa has a chance to apologize properly. The suggestion caught me off guard. I had expected a longer estrangement, more resistance before any reconciliation. She wants to apologize? Well, Richard paused. She hasn't said those exact words, but I know she feels terrible. She's just having trouble admitting it. I ran my fingers along the neatly folded stack of towels beside me, considering. Part of me wanted to insist on a direct apology before any new invitation was extended. But a wiser part recognized the opportunity being offered, a chance to bridge. The divide before it widened beyond repair. Sunday would be fine, I said finally. But Richard, I don't want another confrontation. If she's not ready, she'll be ready, he interrupted, his tone suddenly firm. I've made it clear how important this is. We'll be there at 1, if that works for you. After confirming the time, we said our goodbyes. I sat motionless on the bed for several minutes afterward, torn between hope and trepidation. The prospect of another disastrous encounter weighed heavily on me. Yet there was also a quiet certainty that this meeting was necessary, a step that couldn't be bypassed if there was to be any real relationship between Vanessa and me in the future. Sunday arrived with clear skies and oppressive humidity. Typical Atlanta summer day. I had decided against preparing another elaborate meal, opting instead for a simple lunch of cold gazpacho and grilled sandwiches. Less time in the kitchen meant more time to prepare myself emotionally for whatever might unfold. They arrived precisely at 1 o'clock. Richard looked tired, the skin beneath his eyes shadowed in a way that reminded me of his college finals. Weeks. Vanessa, by contrast, was as immaculate as ever in a pale blue dress that enhanced her slender frame. But there was something different about her demeanor, a hesitancy that hadn't been present before. "Carmen," she said as she crossed. The threshold, her voice softer than I remembered. "Thank you for having us again." I nodded, accepting the bouquet of lilies she extended. An olive branch, perhaps, but not an apology. Not yet. Lunch was a stilted affair. Richard maintained a steady stream of safe conversation, updates about his latest case, questions about my garden, reminiscences about a family vacation from his childhood that Vanessa couldn't possibly find interesting. She contributed little, pushing gazpacho around her bowl without consuming much. I noticed her glancing repeatedly at the family photographs on my wall, particularly the one of my parents in front of their grocery store. "Your parents owned their own business?" she asked suddenly, interrupting Richard's anecdote about a fishing trip. I nodded. "A small grocery in Bogotá. After the political situation worsened in the late 70s, they sold it to finance our move to America." "And then?" She leaned forward slightly, seemingly genuinely curious. "Then reality set in," I said simply. "Their degrees weren't recognized. Here. Their English was limited. My father eventually found work as a janitor at a high school. My mother cleaned houses alongside me until her arthritis became too severe." Vanessa's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or the beginnings of understanding. "That must have been difficult for them." It was. I met her gaze directly. But they never complained. They measured success differently than most. To them, success meant seeing me graduate from nursing school. It meant knowing I would have opportunities they never had. Richard reached over and squeezed my hand, his eyes suspiciously bright. "They would be so proud of you, Mom." "I hope so," I said quietly. An awkward silence descended. Vanessa pushed her bowl away, then squared her shoulders as if coming to a decision. "Carmen, about last week. The jarring ring of her cell phone cut through the tension. She glanced at the screen, her expression immediately shifting to alarm. "I need to take this. It's my mother." As she stepped onto the porch for privacy, Richard exhaled slowly. "She was about to apologize," he said, disappointment evident in his voice. "She had a whole speech prepared." "There will be other opportunities," I assured him, though I couldn't help but feel the moment had been lost. Vanessa returned 5 minutes later, her complexion noticeably paler. "We need to go," she said to Richard. "Mother's had some kind of episode. The housekeeper found her unconscious in the bathroom." The word housekeeper hung briefly in the air between us, a reminder of our previous encounter, but the gravity of the situation overshadowed any lingering tension. "Of course," I said, already standing to clear the table. "Is she at the hospital?" "Which one?" "North Side," Vanessa replied, gathering her purse with unsteady hands. "Father's traveling again, and I don't know what to do. I've never dealt with something like this." 25 years of nursing experience kicked in automatically. "Northside has an excellent cardiac unit. Who's her doctor? Did the housekeeper call an ambulance or drive her?" Vanessa blinked rapidly, seeming startled by my practical questions. I don't know all the details, just that she collapsed and is being transported." I made a swift decision. "You're in no condition to drive, and Richard's had 2 glasses of wine. Let me take you. I know the hospital well, worked there for a rotation years ago." Richard nodded gratefully, but Vanessa hesitated, conflict evident in her expression. Pride wrestled with necessity, and for a moment I thought she would refuse. Then her shoulders slumped slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That would be helpful." The drive to Northside passed in tense silence. Vanessa sat rigid in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, occasionally checking her phone for updates. Richard occupied the back seat, leaning forward periodically to rest a reassuring hand on his wife's shoulder. At the hospital, my nursing background proved invaluable. I navigated the emergency intake system efficiently, asking targeted questions that elicited useful information while Richard handled insurance forms. Vanessa seemed increasingly disoriented by the hospital environment, flinching at the overhead announcements and the sight of gurneys being wheeled past. "Have you spent much time in hospitals?" I asked gently as we waited to be allowed into the treatment area. She shook her head. "Almost none. My family generally uses private clinics." "They can be overwhelming places," I acknowledged, "but also places of incredible compassion and expertise. Try to remember everyone here has the same goal, helping your mother recover." A doctor emerged before she could respond, introducing himself as Dr. Patel, the attending physician. "Mrs. Spencer experienced what appears to be a vasovagal syncope, essentially a fainting episode. We're running tests to rule out anything more serious, but her vitals are stable now." Vanessa visibly relaxed at this news. "Can I see her?" "Briefly," Dr. Patel nodded. "She's still quite groggy from the medication we administered." As he led Vanessa away, Richard turned to me with a grateful smile. "Thanks for taking charge, Mom. Vanessa completely falls apart in crises. She's brilliant at planning charity, galas, and negotiating corporate sponsorships, but emergencies shut her down." "Everyone has different strengths," I said diplomatically, though privately I was reassessing my impression of my daughter-in-law. The poised, judgmental woman from our dinner seemed far removed from the vulnerable person I'd just witnessed. Vanessa returned 30 minutes later, looking marginally calmer. "She's resting. They want to keep her overnight for observation." She hesitated, then added, "She asked for you, Richard. Room 327. As my son hurried off to visit his mother-in-law, Vanessa and I were left alone in the waiting area. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across her face, emphasizing the strain of the past hour. Without her perfect makeup and controlled environment, she looked younger, almost vulnerable. Your mother will likely be fine, I offered, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Vasovagal episodes are frightening but rarely serious. She nodded distractedly, then surprised me by asking, "Is this what you did? As a nurse?" "Sometimes. I specialized in geriatric care eventually, but I worked in emergency services early in my career." "It must have been difficult," she said, quietly, "dealing with people on the worst days of their lives." "It was," I acknowledged, "but also deeply meaningful. There's a particular privilege in being present for someone during their most vulnerable moments, in being able to offer competence and compassion when they're most needed." Vanessa was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the institutional artwork on the opposite wall. "My mother's housekeeper saved her life today," she said finally. "Found her unconscious, called the ambulance, knew enough first aid to position her properly until help arrived." She looked directly at me for the first time since we'd arrived. "Her name is Louisa. She's worked for my parents for 18 years, and I couldn't have told you her last name until today when I saw it on the intake forms as the reporting witness." I didn't respond immediately, sensing there was more she needed to say. "She was crying in the hallway just now," Vanessa continued. "Not because she was upset about the extra work or inconvenience, but because she was genuinely worried. She calls my mother Senora Catherine with this mix of formality and affection that I've never really noticed before." She shook her head slightly. "I've spent my entire life in that house, surrounded by people who cooked our meals and cleaned our spaces, and I never really saw them, not as people with their own lives and feelings." The admission hung between us, raw and authentic in a way I hadn't expected from her. Before I could formulate a response, Richard returned, looking relieved. "Catherine's asking for you now, Van," he said. "She seems much better, already complaining about the hospital gown." As Vanessa stood to go, she paused beside my chair. "Thank you," she said softly, "for driving us, for knowing what to do, for—" She gestured vaguely, seemingly at a loss for words. "Just thank you." It wasn't the apology she had almost offered at lunch, but somehow, in this sterile hospital waiting room with its uncomfortable chairs and artificial lighting, it felt like the beginning of something more meaningful, a crack in the carefully constructed wall between us. What I didn't realize then was that this moment represented just the first hairline fracture in Vanessa's worldview. Over the coming weeks, those fractures would spread and deepen until everything she thought she knew about worth, dignity, and human connection would shatter completely, culminating in that 2 a.m. phone call that would change us both forever. Catherine. Spencer was discharged from the hospital 2 days later with a diagnosis of dehydration and low blood pressure. Nothing life-threatening, but concerning enough that her doctor recommended someone stay with her for at least a week. With Vanessa's father away on business in Singapore and unable to return immediately, the responsibility fell to Vanessa. I learned this from Richard, who called to update me the evening after Catherine's release. "Vanessa's staying at her parents' house in Buckhead," he explained. "She's trying to work remotely, but it's complicated. Her mother isn't an easy patient." "Few people are," I said, thinking of my decades in nursing. "Does she have help?" "There's the housekeeper, Louisa. But Vanessa says her mother needs more specialized care. The doctor recommended a home health aide, but apparently Catherine is refusing." I recognized the pattern immediately. Proud, independent people often make the most resistant patients, fighting assistance even when it's clearly needed. "If there's anything I can do," I offered, not expecting Richard to take me up on it. "Actually," he said hesitantly, "I was hoping you might be willing to talk to Vanessa. Give her some advice about managing the situation. She's struggling." The request surprised me. After our last interactions, Vanessa seemed the last person who would welcome my guidance. Are you sure she'd be open to that? She asked. For it, Richard said, a note of wonder in his voice. Specifically. Said you handled everything at the hospital so efficiently, maybe you could help her figure out what to do now. I felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. Professional pride that my expertise was being recognized, certainly, but also cautious hope that perhaps the hospital experience had begun to shift something in my daughter-in-law's perception, not just of me, but of the value of work she had previously dismissed. Of course, I said. She can call any time. Actually, she was hoping you might come over tomorrow, see the setup firsthand and offer suggestions. The next day found me driving through the exclusive Buckhead neighborhood where Vanessa had grown up. The Spencer home was exactly as I had imagined it. A sprawling colonial-style mansion set back from the street behind manicured hedges and an ornate iron gate. The kind of residence that appeared in architectural magazines and holiday home tours. Louisa answered the door, a petite woman perhaps a few years older than me with warm brown eyes and hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple blue dress that wasn't quite a uniform, but clearly designated her role in the household. Mrs. Vega? She asked with a slight accent. Senora Vanessa is expecting you. Please come in. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Soaring ceilings, gleaming hardwood floors, artwork that even my untrained eye could recognize as valuable. Louisa led me through a formal living room that looked barely used to a sun-filled conservatory at the back of the house. Vanessa sat there amid potted palms and orchids, her laptop open on a wicker table beside her. She rose when she saw me, smoothing her cream linen pants with an automatic gesture. Carmen, thank you for coming. I appreciate you taking the time. Her tone was formal, but not cold, the voice of someone navigating unfamiliar territory with caution. I noticed dark circles beneath her eyes, partially concealed with makeup but still visible. How is your mother doing? I asked. Physically, better, emotionally? She sighed. She's upstairs, refusing to come down, refusing to use the walker the hospital sent home with her, refusing to drink the electrolyte solution the doctor prescribed. I nodded sympathetically. That's not unusual. Sudden health events often trigger emotional responses that seem irrational from the outside. I don't know how to handle her, Vanessa admitted, gesturing for me to sit. We've never had this kind of role reversal before. Louisa appeared with a tray of iced tea and small pastries, setting it down silently before withdrawing. Noticed Vanessa thank her, a small courtesy I suspected might not have been her habit before. Tell me about the current arrangement, I suggested. Who's providing what kind of care? What's the schedule like? Vanessa outlined a chaotic situation. Louisa was handling the household tasks as usual, but had no medical training. Vanessa was trying to manage her mother's medication schedule and doctor's instructions while simultaneously working remotely. Catherine was resisting every suggestion, insisting she was fine despite nearly fainting again yesterday when she tried to shower without assistance. The doctor recommended a home health aide, but Mother refuses to have a stranger helping with personal care, Vanessa explained, frustration evident in her voice. She says it's humiliating enough to need help without adding an audience. That's a common reaction, I said. Vulnerability can be terrifying, especially for people accustomed to being in control. She'll accept help from Louisa for some things, Vanessa continued. They have a relationship I don't fully understand. Sometimes it seems almost like friendship, but with these rigid boundaries, neither of them ever crosses. I thought about the complex dynamics that often develop in households with long-term domestic staff, relationships that exist in a gray area between employment and family, governed by unwritten rules established over years. How long has Louisa worked for your parents? I asked. 18 years, since I was in middle school. Vanessa stared into her iced tea. She knows more about running this house than I ever will. Knows my mother's preferences better than I do, apparently. There was something vulnerable in this admission, a recognition of knowledge valued and acquired through work Vanessa had previously dismissed as beneath notice. That kind of institutional memory is invaluable, I observed, but it doesn't make you less of a daughter for not having it. She looked up, surprised. How did you know that's what I was thinking? Because I've seen that expression on hundreds of adult children suddenly thrust into caregiving roles. The realization that someone who isn't family might understand your parents' needs better than you do can feel like a failure. It does, she admitted quietly. I should know these things. I grew up here. But somehow I never paid attention to the details of how this household actually functions. Before I could respond, a bell chimed somewhere deeper in the house. Vanessa winced. That's Mother. She refuses to text or call like a normal person. Insists on using the old servant bell system my grandfather installed. I'll come with you, I offered, if you don't mind. Sometimes a new face can break a pattern of resistance. Catherine Spencer's bedroom suite occupied the entire east wing of the second floor, a space larger than my entire first apartment. The woman herself was a more elegant version of Vanessa, with silver-streaked dark hair and the same perfect posture despite her current health challenges. She sat propped against satin pillows in a massive four-poster bed, looking distinctly unimpressed by my presence. Mother, this is Carmen Vega, Richard's mother-in-law, Vanessa introduced me. She was a nurse for many years and helped tremendously at the hospital. I thought she might have some suggestions for making you more comfortable during your recovery. Catherine surveyed me with cool assessment. The Colombian, she said finally. Richard mentioned you. I smiled, unruffled by her tone. I'd dealt with far more difficult patients in my career. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Spencer. How are you feeling today? Imprisoned, she replied crisply, by well-meaning people who seem determined to treat me like an invalid over a simple fainting spell. Not so simple, I corrected gently. Dehydration severe enough to cause loss of consciousness is a serious condition, especially when combined with hypotension. Your doctor was right to be concerned. Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, at being directly contradicted. You're very forthright, Mrs. Vega. Carmen, please. And yes, 30 years of nursing taught me that honesty serves patients better than false reassurance. She studied me for a moment longer, then gestured to a chair beside the bed. You might as well sit, since I assume you're here to lecture me about taking my medication and using that ridiculous walker. I sat, but shook my head. I'm not here to lecture. I'm here to listen, actually. To understand what's most important to you right now, so we can find ways to support your recovery that respect your priorities. This approach clearly wasn't what she expected. She glanced at Vanessa, who hovered uncertainly by the door, then back to me. What's important is regaining my independence as quickly as possible. Jeffrey returns from Singapore next week, and I refuse to be bedridden when he arrives. I nodded. That's a reasonable goal. Independence matters. But there's a difference between dependency and interdependence. Accepting strategic help now might actually speed your return to full autonomy. Over the next hour, I engaged Catherine in a frank discussion about her condition, her frustrations, and her options. Drawing on decades of experience with reluctant patients, I emphasized choice and control wherever possible, helping her see how certain concessions now would serve her longer-term objectives. By the time we finished, she had grudgingly agreed to use the walker when moving between rooms, to follow the medication schedule Vanessa had created, and to consider a part-time home health aide, but only if she could interview candidates personally. You're quite persuasive, Carmen, she said as I prepared to leave. Vanessa mentioned you were at the hospital when I was admitted. I appreciate that. It was no trouble, I assured her, Family helps family. A subtle tension appeared in her expression. Yes, well, Vanessa, see Mrs. Vega out, would you? As we descended the grand staircase, Vanessa seemed lost in thought. When we reached the foyer, she turned to me with genuine amazement. How did you do that? She's been fighting me on everything for 2 days, and you got her to agree to all of it in an hour. I didn't approach her as a daughter trying to parent her mother, I explained. That dynamic almost always creates resistance. I approached her as one adult speaking to another about practical solutions to a temporary problem. You treated her with dignity, Vanessa said slowly, as if processing a revelation, even while discussing things that make her feel vulnerable. Dignity matters to everyone, I said simply, especially when circumstances threaten to strip it away. We had reached the front door when Luisa appeared from a side hallway, carrying a laundry basket. Senora Vanessa, the pharmacy delivered Mrs. Spencer's new prescription. I put it on the kitchen counter. Thank you, Luisa, Vanessa replied, then hesitated. Actually, could you wait a moment? I'd like to introduce you properly to Mrs. Vega. Luisa set down her basket, smoothing her hands over her apron with a gesture that reminded me poignantly of my own mother. This is Carmen Vega, Richard's mother, Vanessa said. Carmen, this is Luisa Mendez. She's been with our family for 18 years, and apparently she's been keeping us all functioning without any of us fully appreciating it. The formal introduction clearly surprised Luisa, whose eyes widened slightly before she extended her hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Vega. Likewise, I said, taking her hand and switching to Spanish. I understand you were the one who found Mrs. Spencer when she collapsed. Your quick action likely prevented a much worse outcome. Luisa's face softened at the use of our shared language. I was terrified, she admitted in Spanish. Mrs. Spencer has always been so strong. Seeing her that way, it must have been frightening, I agreed. But you handled it perfectly. Vanessa watched our exchange with an unreadable expression. When Luisa excused herself to return to her tasks, my daughter-in-law walked me to my car in thoughtful silence. I didn't know you and Luisa would have that connection, she said finally as I unlocked my door. The shared language, I mean. There are probably many connections you haven't noticed, I observed gently. When we categorize people primarily by their function in our lives, we miss the full complexity of who they are. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the impressive facade of her childhood home. I've been thinking about what you said at dinner that night, she said eventually. About cleaning houses while studying nursing. About being seen, or not seen, by the families you worked for. I waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. I've spent the last 2 days watching Luisa manage this household with a competence I could never match, she said, anticipating my mother's needs, handling countless details I never even considered, and I realized I've benefited from that. Competence my entire life without acknowledging it, without acknowledging her. The admission felt significant, a crack widening in the foundation of assumptions she'd built her worldview upon. It's never too late to start seeing people more fully, I said, to recognize the dignity in all forms of work and the humanity in those who perform it. Vanessa met my eyes directly for perhaps the first time since we'd met. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. What I said at dinner was inexcusable, prejudiced, unkind. I'm deeply sorry, Carmen. The apology was straightforward, without qualification or defensiveness. Another surprise from this woman who had initially seemed so rigidly defined by social hierarchy. I nodded, accepting it without need for elaboration. Will you come back? Tomorrow? She asked as I got into my car. Mother actually listened to you, and I could use the help. Plus, she added with a hint of self-deprecating humor, I have absolutely no idea how to organize medication schedules or interpret these discharge instructions. Of course, I agreed. That's what family does. As I drove away, I reflected on the unexpected turns this situation had taken. What had begun with a painful rejection at my dinner table was evolving into something I couldn't have anticipated. An opportunity for genuine connection with my daughter-in-law, built on shared concern for her mother and mutual recognition of each other's strengths. What I didn't yet understand was how this evolution would accelerate over the coming weeks, or how Catherine Spencer's health crisis would ultimately lead to that middle-of-the-night phone call that would transform both Vanessa's life and mine, in ways neither of us could imagine. Over the next week, I fell into an unexpected routine. Each morning, I would drive to the Spencer mansion to help Vanessa manage her mother's care. We developed a system. I handled the medical aspects, showing Vanessa how to monitor blood pressure and recognize warning signs, while she coordinated with doctors and managed her mother's increasingly demanding social calendar as Catherine insisted on resuming normal activities. What began as clinical assistance gradually evolved into something more personal. One afternoon, as we sat in the kitchen reviewing Catherine's medication schedule, Vanessa surprised me with a question that had nothing to do with her mother's health. "How did you do it?" she asked, setting down the prescription list we'd been organizing. "Work as a housekeeper while studying nursing? It must have been exhausting." I looked up, caught off guard by her sudden interest in my past. "It was," I admitted. "But when you have no choice, you find reserves of strength you didn't know existed." "I'd like to hear about it," she said, her voice tentative. "If you don't mind sharing." Outside the kitchen window, spring rain fell steadily on the immaculate gardens. Inside, the quiet hum of the refrigerator and distant sounds of Louisa vacuuming upstairs created a strangely intimate atmosphere. For a moment, I considered deflecting, changing the subject back to Catherine's care, or offering only the sanitized version of my story that I usually shared at dinner parties. But something about Vanessa's expression, a genuine curiosity I hadn't seen before, made me choose honesty instead. "I arrived in Atlanta in 1981, I began. 19 years old with a tourist visa, $237 in my pocket, and a dream of becoming a nurse. My cousin had promised to help me find work and housing, but when I arrived, I discovered she had moved to Miami. Without telling me." Vanessa's eyes widened. "You were alone? With no contacts?" "Completely alone," I confirmed. I spoke broken English learned from American movies. I had a high school education from Columbia that no one here recognized, but I had determination and deadline. My visa would expire in 3 months. I described those first desperate weeks, sleeping on a church pew because I couldn't afford housing, washing in public restrooms, stretching my dwindling funds with free coffee shop crackers and discounted day-old bread. The turning point came when I overheard 2 women at a bus stop discussing a cleaning job their friend had just quit. I approached them, terrified but desperate, and asked for details, I continued. They gave me an address in Buckhead, actually. Not far from here. "What happened?" Vanessa asked, fully engaged now. I showed up the next morning at a house much like this one. The woman who answered the door looked at me like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. My clothes were clean but worn, my accent thick. She asked if I had references. Of course I didn't. "Did she turn you away?" I shook my head. That's where Providence intervened. Her regular cleaner had quit without notice before a major dinner party. She was hosting the hospital board that evening, 12 people, formal service. She was desperate. "So she hired you," Vanessa surmised. "On a trial basis," I clarified. 1 day's work. If I performed adequately, she would consider a regular arrangement. I described the grueling day that followed, scrubbing every surface in a 3-story house, polishing silver I was terrified of damaging, pressing linens for a table I would never be invited to sit at. I worked 16 hours straight. My hands were raw, my back screaming in pain. But when I finished, that house gleamed. "Did she keep you on?" Vanessa asked. "She did. and unknowingly changed the course of my life. I smiled at the memory. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Winters. She was the head of nursing at Piedmont Hospital. Understanding dawned in Vanessa's expression. She helped you become a nurse. Not. Immediately, I said. For the first year, I was simply her housekeeper. I cleaned twice weekly, learned to prepare basic American dishes, improved my English by reading discarded newspapers and magazines while eating lunch in her kitchen. I described how I had gradually built a small client base, cleaning for 3 different households, saving every penny, sleeping on a fold-out couch in an apartment shared with 4 other immigrant women. How I had enrolled in night English, classes at the community center, paying with carefully counted quarters and dimes. The turning point came when Dr. Winters found me studying an anatomy textbook during my lunch break, I continued. It was her daughter's old college text. I thought she'd be angry that I was touching their books, but instead, she sat down and asked why I was interested in it. What did you tell her? Vanessa asked. The truth. That I had dreamed of being a nurse since I was a little girl watching the nuns tend to patients at the mission clinic near our home in Colombia. That I had come to America specifically to pursue that dream, however unlikely it seemed. To my surprise, Dr. Winters had been impressed rather than dismissive. She began leaving nursing journals for me to read, correcting my pronunciation of medical terms, explaining concepts I didn't understand. Eventually, she helped me apply for a green card under a special skills category, wrote a recommendation letter for the nursing program at Georgia State, and even offered a flexible work schedule that would accommodate my classes. She changed my life through small acts of recognition, I told Vanessa. Not grand gestures, but consistent acknowledgement of my humanity and potential. Of all the houses I cleaned, hers was the only one where I was invited to occasionally join. The family for coffee, where my birthday was remembered, where I was seen as Carmen rather than the help. Vanessa was silent for a long moment after I finished speaking. I've never thought about it from that perspective, she finally said. The profound impact of simply being seen. The conversation might have ended there if Catherine hadn't called down requesting tea. As Vanessa moved to prepare it, Louisa entered the kitchen carrying a basket of freshly laundered linens. Louisa, Vanessa said suddenly, how long have you lived in Atlanta? The question clearly surprised the housekeeper, who paused in the doorway. 23 years, Señora Vanessa. And before that? Where is your family from? Bogotá. Originally, Louisa replied, setting down her basket. Though I lived in Medellin for several years before coming to the United States. I looked up, startled by this coincidence. My family was from Bogotá as well. Louisa smiled. I know. I recognized your accent immediately. You two should talk, Vanessa said, completing the tea preparation. Carmen, while I take this up to Mother, perhaps you and Louisa could chat? I've realized I know almost nothing about Louisa's life before she came to work for us, which is inexcusable, after 18 years. After Vanessa left, an awkward silence fell between Louisa and me. We were country women, both immigrants who had built lives in a foreign land, but the different trajectories of our lives created an invisible barrier. You don't have to talk to me if you're busy, I offered, sensing her discomfort. It's not that, she said, sitting at the kitchen table across from me. It's just strange. In 18 years, this is the first time anyone in this family has expressed interest in my background. Vanessa seems to be reconsidering many things lately, I observed. Louisa nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Spencer's illness has affected her deeply. I've seen her watching me these past days, really seeing what I do here for the first time. Our conversation flowed more naturally after that initial awkwardness. We discovered more connections. We had attended neighboring schools in Bogotá, shared memories of the same historic plaza where we had both played as children, even remembered the same political unrest that had eventually driven our families to seek safety elsewhere. Did you always plan to be a housekeeper? I asked, curious about her path. She shook her head. I was a teacher in Colombia, elementary education. When I came here, my credentials weren't recognized. Cleaning houses was meant to be temporary. What happened? Life, she said simply. My son became ill, leukemia. The Spencer family offered health insurance, steady hours, better pay than I could find elsewhere. They were kind during his treatments, flexible when he needed me. By the time he recovered, years had passed, and I had built a place here. How is your son now? I asked. A proud smile transformed her face. Miguel graduated from Georgia Tech last year, engineering. He's working for a firm downtown. That's wonderful, I said sincerely. All of this, she gestured at the grand kitchen around us, was worth it for his opportunities. But sometimes, she hesitated. Sometimes you wonder about the teacher you might have been, I finished for her. The path not taken. Exactly. She folded her hands on the table, studying them thoughtfully. Though I've made peace with it. There is dignity in all honest work, as my father always said. My father said the same thing, I replied, struck by the parallel. Vanessa returned, to find us deep in conversation, comparing neighborhoods in Bogotá and sharing memories of Colombian holidays. She paused in the doorway, observing our animated exchange without interrupting. When Luisa eventually excused herself to continue her work, Vanessa took her place at the table. I've never seen Luisa like that, she said. So animated. So knowledgeable. She was a teacher in Colombia, I told her. Did you know that? The surprise on Vanessa's face answered my question. A teacher? No, I had no idea. Her son graduated from Georgia Tech last year, engineering. Vanessa was silent, absorbing this information. All these years, she said finally. All these years, and I never once asked. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Jeffrey, Spencer, Catherine's husband, returning early from his Singapore trip. Tall and distinguished with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority, he swept into the kitchen with the energy of a much younger man. Vanessa, darling, he greeted his daughter with a quick kiss on the cheek. How's your mother? The pilot told me about her hospitalization when I boarded in Tokyo. She's much better, Dad. Resting upstairs. This is Carmen Vega, Richard's mother-in-law. She's been helping with Mother's care. Jeffrey turned to me with practiced charm. Mrs. Vega, how kind of you to assist. I understand you have medical background? I was a nurse for 30 years, I confirmed, extending my hand. He shook it firmly. Well, the Spencer family is in your debt. Now, if you'll excuse me, I should go up to Catherine. After he departed, Vanessa sighed. That's Hurricane Jeffrey, always moving at maximum speed. He seems devoted to your mother, I observed. He is, in his way. Their relationship has always been. She searched for the right words. Complementary. He builds empires, she manages their social capital. It works for them. Later that afternoon, as I prepared to leave, Jeffrey intercepted me in the foyer. Mrs. Vega, a moment if you don't mind. He led me into his study, a masculine space of leather and mahogany that reminded me of law firms I'd visited as a patient advocate. Vanessa tells me you've been instrumental in Catherine's recovery. I'd like to compensate you for your time. He reached for his checkbook, but I raised a hand to stop him. That's not necessary, Mr. Spencer. I've been happy to help. Nonsense, he insisted. Your expertise is valuable. I always believe in paying for value. I didn't offer my help as a professional service, I explained, but as family. Richard and Vanessa are my family now, which makes you and Catherine family by extension. He studied me with new interest. That's an unusual perspective in my experience. Perhaps, I acknowledged, but it's how I was raised. When family needs help, you provide it without expectation of payment. He seemed genuinely perplexed by my refusal, but eventually nodded. As you wish. But please know that if you ever need anything, any doors opened, any introductions made, you have only to ask. I don't leave debts unsettled. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the day's conversations. What had begun as a simple arrangement to help with Catherine's medical care had evolved into something more significant. A window into lives I would never have glimpsed otherwise, connections I couldn't have anticipated. Vanessa's growing awareness of the humanity behind roles she had previously dismissed as merely functional. Louisa's story of sacrifice and achievement through her son. Jeffrey's transaction-based worldview that assigned monetary value to all relationships and services. These revelations were pieces of a larger picture gradually coming into focus, a landscape of privilege and service, of seen and unseen labor, of lives intersecting in ways both meaningful and problematic. I couldn't yet discern the full pattern these pieces would ultimately form, but I sensed we were building toward something important. A reckoning, perhaps, or a reconciliation. What I didn't realize was how soon that culmination would arrive, or how a seemingly minor discovery the very next day would accelerate everything, setting in motion the chain of events that would lead to that middle-of-the-night phone call and change the course of both Vanessa's life and mine. The discovery happened by accident, as most pivotal moments do. I had arrived at the Spencer home earlier than usual the next morning. Catherine had developed a slight fever overnight, and Vanessa had called, concern evident in her voice despite the early hour. Though the fever wasn't dangerous, likely just a minor reaction to one of her medications, I'd promised to come first thing to check on her. The house was unusually quiet when I arrived. Jeffrey had already left for his office downtown. Catherine was still sleeping, the fever having broken around dawn. Vanessa met me at the door in silk pajamas and a cashmere robe, dark circles under her eyes testifying to a sleepless night. "Thank you for coming so early," she said, leading me to the kitchen where coffee was brewing. "I know Mother's fine now, but when her temperature hit 101, I panicked." "You did the right thing," I assured her. "Better to be cautious, especially with her blood pressure issues." We sat at the kitchen island, the morning sun creating patterns on the marble surface as it filtered through the garden windows. Vanessa looked around distractedly, then frowned. "Louisa should be here by now. She's never late." As if summoned by her name, Louisa hurried in through the service entrance, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. "I'm so sorry, Senora Vanessa. The bus was delayed. An accident on Peachtree. I came as quickly as I could." "It's fine, Louisa," Vanessa said, her tone gentler than I might have expected a few weeks ago. "Mother's still sleeping. Carmen's here to check on her fever." Louisa nodded gratefully, setting down her bag and moving immediately to start her morning routine. As she hung her coat in the small utility closet off the kitchen, something fell from the pocket. A worn leather wallet that landed open on the tile floor, revealing a small collection of photographs. I bent to help her gather them, pausing, as one particular image caught my eye. It was old and creased from frequent handling, a faded color photograph of a young woman in a blue graduation gown standing proudly in front of a brick building. Something about her face, her posture, triggered a distant memory. "Universidad Nacional de Colombia?" I asked, reading the partly visible lettering on the building behind her. Louisa nodded, taking the photo carefully. "My graduation. Teachers? College, 1984. I was there that year," I said slowly, the memory crystallizing. "My cousin Mariella was graduating. I attended the ceremony right before I left for America." Louisa froze, staring at me with sudden intensity. "Mariela Santos?" "Yes," I confirmed, surprised. "You knew her?" "We were roommates for 3 years," Louisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was my closest friend. Vanessa watched our exchange with growing curiosity. You knew each other in Colombia? Not exactly, I explained, still processing this extraordinary coincidence. But we were connected without realizing it. Mariella was the cousin who promised to help me when I arrived in Atlanta, but she moved to Miami before I got here. She left because her father fell ill, Louisa added. She was devastated about breaking her promise to you. She tried to find you when she returned to Atlanta 2 years later, but no one knew where you were. The revelation struck me with unexpected force. For decades, I had carried a quiet resentment toward Mariella, believing she had abandoned me without concern for my welfare. To learn now that she had legitimate reasons, that she had even tried to find me later, shifted something fundamental in my understanding of my own past. Is she still in Miami? I asked. Louisa shook her head sadly. Cancer 5 years ago, but her daughter Pilar lives in Tampa. We exchange Christmas cards. As we continued talking, piecing together the connections between our lives that had existed unseen for so many years, I noticed Vanessa watching us with an odd expression. Not boredom or impatience as I might have expected, but something that looked almost like longing. What an extraordinary coincidence, she said when we finally fell silent. It's like you were meant to reconnect after all these years. Life has a way of completing circles we don't even know we're drawing, I agreed. Mariella was indirectly responsible for my entire career path. If she hadn't promised to help me, I might never have come to America. If I hadn't been abandoned when I arrived, I might never have found the strength to build my own way. And if you hadn't come to America, Vanessa added softly, Richard might never have met me, and we wouldn't be sitting here now. The observation surprised me, not just for its content, but for the thoughtful tone behind it. This was a different Vanessa from the woman who had dismissed my cooking just a few weeks ago. Louisa excused herself to begin her morning duties, taking the treasured photo with her. Vanessa and I remained at the kitchen island, a contemplative silence stretching between us. I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday, she finally said, about Dr. Winters seeing your potential beyond your role as her housekeeper. I nodded, encouraging her to continue. I had a similar mentor in college, Professor Abernathy. She changed my life by seeing capabilities in me that no one else had noticed, not even myself. Vanessa twisted her coffee cup slowly. But I never made the connection until now, how that experience of being truly seen mirrors what you described, the profound impact it can have. Recognition is a powerful gift, I said. Perhaps the most meaningful one we can offer another person. I haven't offered that gift very often, she admitted, her gaze fixed on her hands. I've spent most of my life categorizing people according to their utility in my world. I never stopped to consider the fullness of their existence beyond what they could do for me. The self-awareness in this confession struck me as remarkably honest. Recognition isn't just about acknowledging someone's potential, I said carefully. It's also about respecting their current reality, the dignity in whatever work they're doing now, not just what they might become someday. Vanessa looked up, her expression troubled. I've been thinking about that first dinner at your house, what I said about not eating food prepared in a housekeeper's kitchen. It wasn't just rude. It revealed something ugly about how I see the world, about the values I've absorbed without questioning. We all inherit perspectives from our environments, I said gently. The question is what we do once we recognize them. I'm not sure how to unlearn 34 years of conditioning, she confessed. I look at Louisa now and see glimpses of a whole person with her own history and dreams, but then I slip back into old patterns, expecting services without thought, dismissing her insights because of her position. Awareness is the first step, I assured her, and you're already taking it. Our conversation paused as Catherine called from upstairs. Vanessa sighed, setting down her empty coffee cup. Duty. Calls. Would you mind checking her temperature before you leave? Catherine was sitting up in bed when we entered, her color much improved from the day before. She submitted to my examination with minimal complaint, confirming my initial assessment that the fever had been a temporary reaction rather than a sign of something more serious. Your mother is doing fine, I told Vanessa once we had returned to the hallway. Just make sure she continues drinking plenty of fluids and taking the antibiotics as scheduled. I don't know what we would have done without you these past days, Vanessa said, walking me to the door. You've been so generous with your time and knowledge. That's what family does, I replied, using the same words I had shared with Jeffrey the day before. Something in Vanessa's expression shifted at this, a subtle softening around her eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I haven't made it easy for you to see me as family, she said quietly. I've been judgmental and dismissive from the start. We're still getting to know each other, I said diplomatically. Relationships take time to develop. She shook her head slightly. It's more than that. I've been defensive because... She hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. Because deep down, I've always felt like an imposter in my own life. Like I'm playing a role I was assigned rather than chosen. And judging others has been a way to reinforce my own fragile sense of belonging in the world I inhabit. The admission was startlingly raw, especially coming from someone who had always projected such confidence and certainty. Before I could formulate a response, the doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. That must be the physical therapist for Mother's first session, Vanessa said, clearly somewhat relieved by the interruption. Thank you again for coming, Carmen. Will I see you tomorrow? Of course, I assured her. Call if anything changes. With Catherine. As I drove home, I reflected on the morning's revelations. The extraordinary coincidence of Luisa's connection to my cousin. The glimpses of vulnerability and self-awareness Vanessa had shown. The sense that beneath her polished exterior existed a woman struggling with her own questions of identity and purpose. What I didn't realize then was that our brief interrupted conversation had planted a seed in Vanessa's mind, one that would grow with unexpected speed in the coming days. Her comment about feeling like an imposter in her own life hadn't been a casual observation, but the first public acknowledgement of a private crisis that had been building for years. That evening, while I prepared a simple dinner in my kitchen, the same kitchen Vanessa had once refused to eat from, my phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. Something's going on with Vanessa, he wrote. She's been looking through old photo albums all evening, asking strange questions about my childhood, about your early years as a nurse. Did something happen today? I considered how to respond, unsure whether to mention our conversation or the coincidental connection with Luisa. Before I could decide, another text arrived. She just asked me if I thought she was living an authentic life. What does that even mean? I'm worried about her. I set down my cooking spoon, sensing the importance of this moment. The questions Vanessa was asking, about authenticity, about the past, about connections, suggested a significant internal shift was occurring, the kind of awakening that can be both liberating and destabilizing. Just be present with her, I texted back. Listen without judgment. She's processing some important realizations. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking again about the photograph that had triggered the morning's revelations. Luisa in her graduation gown, proud and full of promise, standing at the threshold of a future she couldn't possibly have predicted. How many turning points in our lives are captured in such images? How many versions of ourselves exist in parallel to the ones we eventually become? I thought of Vanessa, surrounded by wealth and privilege, yet feeling like an imposter in her own life. Of Luisa, trained as a teacher but working as a housekeeper to give her son opportunities she never had. Of myself, once a desperate immigrant cleaning houses, Now a retired nurse whose expertise was valued in a mansion I would once have only entered through the service door. The circles we draw in life often complete themselves in unexpected ways. Sometimes the completion takes decades. Sometimes, as I would soon discover, it happens with breathtaking speed. For 2 days following our conversation about authenticity, I didn't hear from Vanessa. Catherine was improving steadily, no longer requiring daily monitoring, so my regular visits to the Spencer home weren't necessary. I returned to my own routines, volunteering at the community health clinic on Wednesday, attending my book club, Thursday morning, catching up on household tasks I'd neglected during the intense period of Catherine's care. But thoughts of Vanessa lingered. The vulnerability she had shown in our last conversation felt significant, a crack in the carefully maintained facade she presented to the world. Richard's concerned text messages suggested whatever she was processing wasn't resolving quickly. On Friday morning, I was deadheading roses in my garden when Richard called. "Mom?" he said without preamble, his voice tight with worry. "Something's really wrong with Vanessa. She didn't come home last night." I set down my garden shears, immediately alert. "What happened?" "I don't know exactly. She had dinner scheduled. With her father. Some charity board they both serve on. She texted around 9 saying she was heading home, but she never arrived. I tried calling, but it goes straight to voicemail. I've contacted her friends, checked with her parents. No one knows where she is." The concern in his voice was palpable, edged with fear. "Have you called hospitals? Filed a police report?" "Yes to hospitals, no to police. They won't consider an adult missing until 24 hours have passed, especially without any signs of foul play. They think she's just taking space." Frustration colored his tone. "But that's not Vanessa. She doesn't just disappear." "When did you last speak with her?" I asked, trying to establish a timeline. "Yesterday morning before work. She seemed distracted, but nothing alarming. She's been quiet all week, spending hours in her home office with the door closed. But when I asked if she was okay, she said she was just busy with the foundation's quarterly reports." Richard and Vanessa's foundation, the Wellington Spencer Youth Initiative, provided scholarships and mentoring for disadvantaged students. It was largely Vanessa's project, though I knew Richard supported it financially. "Has she missed any important appointments?" I asked. "Work commitments? Anything that might give us a clue about what's happening?" "Nothing on her calendar for today that I know of," Richard replied. "But that's the other strange thing. She resigned from the hospital board yesterday, just sent an email withdrawing from all commitments, effective immediately. Her assistant forwarded it to me this morning, asking if Vanessa was ill. The sudden resignation struck me as significant, a concrete action rather than just emotional processing. Did something happen at the dinner with Jeffrey last night? An argument, perhaps? "I don't think so." Richard sounded uncertain. Her father said she was quiet during dinner, but blamed it on exhaustion from dealing with her mother's health issues. They parted on good terms around 8:30. A half hour of unaccounted time before her text saying she was heading home. Not long, but potentially meaningful. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, I decided. Maybe a fresh perspective will help. When I arrived at Richard and Vanessa's penthouse apartment in Midtown, the space reflected the tension of the situation. Coffee cups abandoned on various surfaces, paperwork scattered across the dining table where Richard had clearly been making calls, a sense of disrupted routine. Richard himself looked haggard, his usual polished appearance rumpled from what had obviously been a sleepless night. "Thanks for coming," he said, embracing me briefly. "I feel like I'm losing my mind with worry. Let's think this through. Systematically," I suggested, moving to the kitchen to prepare fresh coffee. The familiar ritual helped focus my thoughts. "You said Vanessa's been in her office a lot this week. Have you looked through her computer? Her files? There might be something that indicates what she's been working on." Richard shook his head. Her laptop's gone, presumably with her, but her desktop is still here. Start there, I advised. In the meantime, I'll try calling her myself. Sometimes people answer for unexpected callers when they're avoiding those closest to them. As Richard disappeared into Vanessa's home office, I dialed her number, unsurprised when it went straight to voicemail. Vanessa, it's Carmen. Richard is worried about you, and honestly, so am I. Whatever you're going through, please just let us know you're safe. You don't have to come home or explain anything right now. Just a text to say you're okay. I ended the call, doubting she would respond but feeling it was worth trying. Moving through the apartment, I looked for anything that might offer insights. Appointment books, notes, anything that seemed out of place. In their bedroom, I noticed Vanessa's typically immaculate dressing area showed signs of hurried packing. Drawers, slightly ajar, spaces in her jewelry box where pieces were missing. So she had packed deliberately, not simply failed to return home. That suggested planning rather than impulsivity, possibly reassuring from a safety perspective, but concerning in what it implied about her state of mind. Richard emerged from the office, holding several printed pages. I found something, he said, his expression troubled. She's been researching her family history, specifically her maternal grandmother, Eliza Wellington. He handed me the papers, printouts of newspaper articles from the 1960s, genealogy website searches, scanned pages from what appeared to be a personal diary. I don't understand, I said, scanning the materials. What's significant about her grandmother? According to these notes, Vanessa discovered that the Wellington family fortune, the money that funded her mother's lifestyle, her own education, even our foundation, originated from her grandmother working as a house cleaner. The irony of this discovery, given Vanessa's earlier comment about not eating food prepared in a housekeeper's kitchen, was not lost on me. How did she find this out? It looks like it started with some old photographs she found while helping. Her mother organized papers during her recovery. Look at this. He handed me a photocopy of a black and white image showing a young woman in a plain uniform, standing beside an older woman in elegant clothing. The caption, handwritten beneath, read, Eliza and Mrs. Harrington, 1962. Vanessa never knew her. Grandmother, she died before Vanessa was born, Richard explained. The family story was always that Eliza married into wealth, bringing Southern grace and refinement to match her husband's Northern industrial fortune. But that wasn't true? Richard shook his head. According to these diary entries Vanessa found, Eliza was actually a house cleaner for the Harrington family in Charleston. She married James Wellington, the family's eldest son, against his parents' wishes. They were essentially cut off financially for several years. I studied the photograph more carefully. The young woman, Eliza, stood with perfect posture, her expression dignified despite her servant's uniform. There was something in her eyes that reminded me of Vanessa, a determined intelligence, a quiet strength. How did they eventually come into money? I asked. James started a construction company that won government contracts during the post-war building boom. They became wealthy in their own right, and eventually the Wellington family reconciled with them. Over time, the truth about Eliza's origins was quietly erased from the family narrative. I sat down slowly, processing the implications. This must have been a profound shock for Vanessa. There's more, Richard said, handing me a final document, a letter Vanessa had apparently begun writing but never sent. It was addressed to her mother. Mother, I found Grandmother Eliza's diaries in the attic storage. Why did you never tell me she worked as a house cleaner? Why construct elaborate stories about her background when the truth, her hard work, her courage in crossing social boundaries, her resilience, is so much more remarkable than the fiction you created? I've spent my entire life believing I came from an unbroken line of privilege, that the comforts I enjoy were my birthright rather than the result of someone else's labor and determination. I've looked down on people who clean homes for a living, never realizing I owe my very existence to a woman who did exactly that work with dignity and pride. The revelation has forced me to question everything, not just about our family history, but about my own identity. Who am I if not the person I've believed myself to be? What values do I actually hold, stripped of the pretensions I've hidden behind? The letter ended there, unsigned and unsent. "When was this written?" I asked. "The file was created yesterday morning," Richard replied, "just hours before she disappeared." I looked around the luxurious apartment, the custom furnishings, the original artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline. All the trappings of the identity Vanessa had constructed, or perhaps had constructed for her. "I think I understand what's happening," I said, slowly. "This isn't just about discovering her grandmother was a house cleaner. It's about realizing her entire self-concept has been built on a foundation of carefully curated falsehoods." Richard ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "So, where does that leave us? Where would she go in the middle of an identity crisis?" Before I could respond, his phone chimed with an incoming text. He grabbed it, relief washing over his features. "It's from Vanessa. I'm safe. Need time to think. Don't worry." I exhaled slowly. That's something, at least. But where is she? Why can't she think at home? Frustration edged back into his voice. "Because home is full of reminders of the identity she's questioning," I explained gently. "Richard, this isn't about you. It's about Vanessa needing space to reconcile who she thought she was with who she actually is." He stared at me, bewilderment evident in his expression. All this because she found out her grandmother was a maid? It was 70 years ago. What does it matter now? His inability to grasp the significance reminded me of how differently men and women often experience questions of identity and heritage. For Richard, a successful attorney with unshakable confidence in his place in the world, Vanessa's crisis might seem disproportionate. But I understood the profound disorientation that comes from discovering core aspects of your self-narrative are built on shifting sand. It matters because we all construct our identities from the stories we're told about where we come from, I said carefully. When those stories are revealed as partial truths or outright fabrications, it calls everything into question. Especially for Vanessa, who has built so much of her self-worth on her family name and social position. Richard seemed about to argue further when his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously, then straightened. "Yes, this is Richard Miller. She's where?" After a brief conversation, he ended the call, looking simultaneously relieved and perplexed. "That was the Alpine Retreat Center in North Georgia. Vanessa checked in last night for their 3-day mindfulness and reflection program. They normally maintain guest privacy, but she listed me as an emergency contact and asked them to call if I reported her missing." "A meditation retreat," I said, nodding slowly. "That makes sense. She's seeking clarity." "The director said she specifically requested their simplest accommodation, the one without Wi-Fi or cell service. That's why she's been unreachable." Richard shook his head in disbelief. Vanessa Spencer voluntarily staying in a cabin without Egyptian cotton sheets or room service. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't heard it directly. I smiled at his bewilderment. People can surprise you when they're in the process of rediscovering themselves. As we waited for the coffee to finish brewing, Richard studied the photograph of Eliza Wellington again. "You know what's strange? If I look closely, Vanessa has her grandmother's eyes exactly. Same shape, same expression." He glanced up. "Maybe she's more like her grandmother than anyone realized. Maybe she's just now discovering that herself," I suggested. What neither of us could have anticipated was how profound that discovery would prove to be. or how dramatically it would reshape not just Vanessa's understanding of herself, but the very foundation of her relationship with both her family of origin and the family she had married into. The retreat center director had mentioned Vanessa would return on Monday. We had no way of knowing that early Sunday morning, precisely 1 month after our disastrous dinner, my phone would ring at 2 a.m., carrying Vanessa's tear-filled voice and a request that would change everything. The weekend passed with Richard, alternating between concern and irritation about Vanessa's retreat. I encouraged patience, suggesting that this time of reflection might be exactly what she needed. Though I didn't say it aloud, I suspected Vanessa was confronting more than just the revelation about her grandmother. She was examining a lifetime of assumptions, biases, and inherited values that suddenly felt foreign to her authentic self. "You should get some rest," I told Richard when he called Saturday evening, still processing his wife's unexpected behavior. "Vanessa will be home soon enough, and when she returns, she'll need your understanding, not your judgment." "I'm trying," he sighed. "It's just so unlike her to disconnect like this. Vanessa's always been the most decisive, put-together person I know. Even in law school, when everyone else was falling apart during finals, she maintained perfect composure. This feels like, I don't know, like I'm seeing a side of her I never knew existed." "Maybe that side has been there all along," I suggested, waiting for permission to emerge. After we hung up, I found myself reflecting on my own life's unexpected turns. How often had I believed I knew exactly who I was, only to have circumstances reveal deeper, unacknowledged aspects of my identity? The young immigrant scrubbing floors while dreaming of a nursing career. The single mother balancing night shifts with helping Richard with homework. The widow rediscovering independence after Antonio's death. Each transition had required its own period of disorientation before new clarity could emerge. I went to bed that night thinking of Vanessa in her sparse cabin, stripped of luxury and distraction, confronting questions that wealth and privilege had previously allowed her to avoid. There was something admirable in her willingness to face these uncomfortable truths, rather than simply burying them beneath the comfortable narrative she'd always accepted. The shrill ring of my phone at 2:17 a.m. jolted me from sleep. Fumbling in the darkness, I answered without checking the caller ID, assuming it must be an emergency. "Hello?" My voice was rough with sleep. "Carmen?" The voice on the other end was barely recognizable, choked with emotion, uncharacteristically hesitant. "It's Vanessa. I'm sorry to call so late." I sat up immediately, fully alert. "Vanessa? Are you all right? Are you safe?" "Yes, I'm safe." A shaky breath. I needed to talk to someone who might understand, and you're the only person I could think of." The vulnerability in her voice touched something deep within me. Just weeks ago, I would have been the last person Vanessa would turn to in a moment of crisis. Now, somehow, I had become her lifeline. "I'm here," I said gently. "Whatever you need." What followed was a torrent of words, tumbling out as if a dam had broken after years of mounting pressure. Vanessa spoke of her discoveries about her grandmother, not just the diary entries Richard had shown me, but personal letters she'd found at the retreat center in a box of family mementos her mother had asked her to store years ago, and she'd never opened until now. "She was remarkable, Carmen," Vanessa said, her voice steadying as she spoke of Eliza. "She worked for the Harringtons from age 16, sending money home to her parents in Appalachia. She put her younger brother through college with her earnings. And when she fell in love with James Wellington, she faced such cruelty from his family, threats, bribes to leave him, public humiliation." "She sounds like a woman of extraordinary strength," I observed. She was. The letters reveal how she navigated that hostility with unfailing dignity, never apologizing for her background, never trying to pretend she was something she wasn't. Vanessa's voice cracked again. "Everything I've never been." "What do you mean?" I've spent my entire life curating an image of effortless privilege. The perfect clothes, the right schools, the appropriate charitable interests. I've looked down on people who didn't fit my narrow definition of success. I've judged them for circumstances beyond their control, just as my great-grandparents judged. My grandmother. The parallel clearly haunted her. I heard rustling on the other end of the line, as if she was shifting position. "Do you know what I found most devastating in those letters?" she continued. My grandmother wrote about house cleaning as meaningful work that allowed her to observe people in their most private spaces, to understand human nature in ways few people ever do. She wasn't ashamed of it. She saw dignity in making spaces beautiful and functional for others. I thought of my own years cleaning homes, how I had sometimes felt the same unexpected satisfaction in transforming chaos into order, in creating environments where others could thrive. How I had observed the intimate details of strangers' lives, the books they read, the photos they displayed, the small rituals that defined their daily existence. Many forms of service offer unique windows into humanity, I agreed. But it takes wisdom to recognize that. Wisdom I clearly lacked, Vanessa said bitterly. When I think about how I behaved at your dinner, refusing to eat food prepared in a housekeeper's kitchen, I'm overwhelmed with shame. I rejected the very foundation my own family was built upon. Vanessa, I said carefully, we all inherit perspectives that deserve examination. The question isn't whether we've held flawed views, but whether we're willing to evolve when confronted with new understanding. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the sound of night insects through the phone, crickets and cicadas creating nature's symphony around her cabin. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, carrying a new quality of resolution. "I've made a decision, Carmen. 2 decisions, actually. I wanted you to be the first to know." "I'm listening," I said. "First, I'm restructuring our foundation. Instead of just providing scholarships, we're creating a comprehensive support program for domestic workers pursuing higher education, tuition assistance, childcare stipends, mentorship, professional development. I want to honor my grandmother's legacy by helping others walk the path she blazed." The vision was impressive, thoughtful, substantive, addressing real barriers rather than offering superficial charity. It suggested Vanessa had been doing more than just emotional processing. During her retreat, she'd been strategically planning how to translate her personal revelation into meaningful action. "That sounds like a powerful way to honor Eliza," I said. "And the second decision?" She hesitated. "This one's more personal. I'm applying to nursing school." Of all the things she might have said, this was perhaps the most unexpected. "Nursing school?" "Yes. It's what I always wanted to do, before my parents guided me toward what they considered more appropriate professions for a Wellington. I was pre-med initially in college, did volunteer work at Children's Hospital that I loved. But Mother insisted it wasn't a suitable career for someone of my background." The revelation offered new context for Vanessa's earlier comment about feeling like an imposter in her own life. She hadn't just been living according to social expectations, she'd actively abandoned her authentic professional aspirations to maintain the family's preferred narrative. "Why nursing specifically?" I asked. "Because it combines everything I value: scientific knowledge, practical skills, direct service to others in their moments of greatest vulnerability. And honestly, Carmen, because watching you during my mother's illness showed me what that vocation truly means, the dignity and authority you brought to her care, the way you honored her humanity while addressing her physical needs." I felt an unexpected warmth spread through me at her words. Without realizing it, I had modeled for Vanessa an alternative path of meaningful contribution, one based not on social standing, but on genuine service. "Nursing is a demanding profession," I said honestly, "both physically and emotionally. It's not something to pursue because of an idealized vision. I know, she acknowledged. I'm not naive about the challenges. But for the first time in my life, I'm choosing something because it resonates with my authentic self, not because it fits some predetermined script about who Vanessa Wellington Spencer is supposed to be. We talked for nearly an hour about practical considerations for her educational plans, about how to approach the conversations she would need to have with Richard and her parents, about the complex process of reclaiming an authentic identity after years of performing a role that never quite fit. As our conversation wound down, Vanessa's voice grew quieter, more reflective. There's one more thing, Carmen. A request. Of course. When I return tomorrow, would you teach me to make those empanadas? The ones from the dinner I ruined? I'd like to learn to cook the dishes that connect you to your heritage, to understand what that tradition means to you. The request moved me deeply, not just for its inherent humility, but for what it represented. Vanessa wasn't simply apologizing for her previous rejection, she was actively seeking connection through the very medium she had once dismissed. I would be honored, I said softly. Thank you. Her voice caught slightly. For answering tonight. For seeing me, the real me, even when I was hiding from myself. After we hung up, I sat awake for a long time, watching the gradual lightening of the sky through my bedroom window. The conversation had left me with a profound sense of witnessing something rare and precious, the moment when a person chooses to align their outer life with their inner truth, regardless of the disruption that choice might cause. Vanessa's journey was just beginning. There would be resistance from those invested in her maintaining her previous identity. There would be moments of doubt and uncertainty as she navigated unfamiliar territory. But she had taken the crucial first step, acknowledging that authenticity requires courage. That meaningful growth often emerges from uncomfortable recognition of our own contradictions. As dawn broke fully over my garden, I found myself thinking again of that first dinner. How Vanessa had pushed away my carefully prepared empanadas, how the rejection had stung in ways that went beyond simple rudeness. In that moment, neither of us could have imagined that a month later, she would call me crying in the middle of the night, having found her way to a deeper understanding not just of me, but of herself. Life's most meaningful journeys rarely follow predictable paths. Sometimes the most profound connections grow from moments of conflict. Sometimes rejection creates the very opening through which transformation can eventually enter. And sometimes the people we initially struggle to understand become the very ones who help us better understand ourselves. As I finally rose to start my day, I smiled at the thought of Vanessa returning home with her newfound clarity, of teaching her to fold empanadas at my kitchen counter, the same kitchen she had once deemed beneath her standards, of watching her navigate the challenging, beautiful process of becoming more fully herself. The human capacity for growth never ceases to amaze me. Even at my age, after all I've witnessed in my years of nursing and living, I find myself regularly humbled by the courage people can summon when confronted with their own limitations. Vanessa's 2 a.m. phone call hadn't just revealed her transformation. It had reminded me of an essential truth I try never to forget, that beneath our carefully constructed identities, we are all works in progress, capable of evolution at any age. Given the right catalyst and the willingness to embrace uncomfortable truths, I began gathering ingredients for the empanadas we would make together. The flour, the spices, the filling, each element a connection to my own heritage, each preparation step a practice passed through generations of women in my family. Soon, these traditions would create a new bridge between Vanessa and me, between her past and her future, between the woman she had pretended to be and the woman she was choosing to become. Vanessa returned from her retreat late Monday morning. Richard had called me when she arrived home, his voice a mixture of relief and lingering concern. She's back. Different somehow. Calmer, but also more. I don't know how to describe. It determined? She asked if you could come over this evening. Said something about cooking lessons? I smiled at his confusion. I'll be there around 5. And Richard? Try to listen with an open mind to whatever she shares with you today. Change isn't always easy to understand, especially when it happens to someone we thought we knew completely. I spent the afternoon preparing, gathering ingredients and selecting the perfect recipe for Vanessa's first culinary lesson. The empanadas we would make together were my mother's special recipe, the ones served on important family occasions, more complex than the version I had prepared for that first disastrous dinner, requiring patience and attention to detail. There was symbolism in that choice that felt appropriate for this new chapter in our relationship. When I arrived at their penthouse, Richard opened the door with an expression I couldn't quite read, part bewilderment, part admiration. "She's told me everything," he said quietly as he took the grocery bags from my hands. "About her grandmother, about nursing school, about restructuring the foundation. It's like she's become a different person over a single weekend." "Not different," I corrected gently. "More herself, perhaps. More aligned with her authentic values." He nodded slowly. "I think you're right. It's just, I'm still processing. Vanessa has always been the one with the clear 5-year plan, the unshakable confidence in her choices. Seeing her embrace such fundamental change is disorienting." "For you and for her," I acknowledged, "but it speaks volumes that she's trusting. You with her vulnerability, with her evolution rather than just her certainty." Vanessa appeared in the kitchen doorway then, and I was struck by the visible changes in her. She wore simple jeans and a cotton blouse, casual clothes I had never seen her in before. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail rather than her usual immaculate updo, but the most notable difference was in her eyes, clear, present, unburdened, by the performance of perfection that had always characterized her demeanor. "Carmen," she said warmly, stepping forward to embrace me. "Thank you for coming." We moved to the kitchen, where I began unpacking the ingredients: flour, lard, spices, the carefully prepared filling I had started early that morning. Vanessa watched with genuine curiosity, asking questions about each component, about the significance of the preparation methods, about the memories these foods carried for me. As we worked side by side, her fingers gradually mastering the delicate technique of folding the empanada dough, our conversation deepened. She shared more details about her time at the retreat, the initial discomfort of silence and simplicity, the gradual clarity that had emerged through meditation and journaling, the moment when she had finally allowed herself to cry for the first time in years. "I realized I've been holding myself to impossible standards," she confessed as she carefully crimped the edge of an empanada. "Not just in terms of achievement, but in terms of never showing weakness, never acknowledging doubt, never questioning the path I was on." "That sounds exhausting," I observed, demonstrating how to adjust her folding technique slightly. It was exhausting and isolating. She looked up from her work, meeting my eyes directly. "I keep thinking about something you said when we were discussing my mother's care, about dignity mattering to everyone, especially when circumstances threaten to strip it away." I nodded, remembering the conversation. "I've been so focused on protecting a certain image of dignity, based on privilege, on never needing help, on appearing flawless, that I missed the deeper dignity that comes from authenticity, from meaningful work, from genuine connection." As the empanadas baked, filling the apartment with the aroma of my childhood, Richard joined us with glasses of wine. Watching him observe his wife, noting the new ease in her movements, the unguarded quality of her laughter, I could see him gradually reconciling himself to this evolved version of the woman he had married. "To new beginnings," he toasted, raising his glass. "And to expanded definitions of success." The moment felt significant, a bridge between what had been and what might now become possible. But the true test of Vanessa's transformation would come the following Sunday, when, We were scheduled to have dinner with Catherine and Jeffrey Spencer. Vanessa had been clear about her intention to share everything with her parents. Her discoveries about Eliza, her decision to pursue nursing, her vision for redirecting the Foundation's mission. "They won't understand," she had told me frankly, as we cleaned the kitchen after our cooking lesson. Especially Mother. So much of her identity is wrapped up in the family mythology, in maintaining the Wellington legacy exactly as it's been defined for generations. "Are you prepared for their disapproval?" I asked. She considered this thoughtfully. "I think so. For the first time, I feel grounded enough in my own truth to withstand their reactions. And honestly, Carmen, even if they never fully understand, I can't go back to living someone else's version of who I'm supposed to be." The Sunday dinner was held at an exclusive private club in Buckhead, the kind of establishment where membership has a multi-year waiting list regardless of wealth, where the staff know each patron's preferences without being told, where the very atmosphere speaks of generational privilege. Richard and I arrived together, Vanessa having gone ahead to ensure everything was arranged to her specifications. He squeezed my hand as we entered the ornate dining room. "This should be interesting," he murmured. Catherine and Jeffrey were already seated at a corner table, Catherine looking remarkably recovered from her recent illness, though perhaps still carrying a certain fragility beneath her elegant exterior. Jeffrey rose to greet us with practiced charm that never quite reached his eyes. "Carmen, how lovely to see you again," Catherine said as I took my seat. "I never properly thanked you for your assistance during my recovery. You were invaluable." "It was my pleasure," I replied sincerely. "And I'm delighted to see you looking so well." Vanessa appeared then, having apparently stepped away to speak with the maitre d'. She kissed her parents in greeting before taking her place beside Richard. I noticed immediately that she had chosen to wear a simple dress rather than the designer attire that would have been her usual choice for such an occasion, not inappropriate for the venue, but distinctly understated compared to her mother's pearls and couture ensemble. "Before we order," Vanessa said once we were all settled, "there's something important I want to share with you. All of you, though Mother and Father, this will be particularly relevant to your understanding of our family." Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. "Darling, is this necessary now? We're here to celebrate your father's new partnership agreement." "It is necessary," Vanessa confirmed gently but firmly, "and it won't take long." With remarkable composure, she proceeded to explain her discoveries about Eliza Wellington, showing her parents the photographs and letter excerpts she had brought with her, detailing how the family history had been sanitized to erase Eliza's origins as a house cleaner. Catherine's face grew increasingly rigid as Vanessa spoke. Jeffrey studied his wife with concern, occasionally glancing at the documents spread discreetly on the table between them. "This is hardly appropriate dinner conversation, Vanessa," Catherine said when her daughter paused. "Whatever you found in those old papers, it doesn't change who we are now." "But it does, Mother," Vanessa insisted. "It changes everything about how I understand our family's values, our privileges, our responsibilities. Grandmother Eliza built her life on hard work, honesty, and the courage to cross social boundaries that others thought should limit her. That's a legacy to honor openly, not hide behind fabricated stories of inherited refinement." Jeffrey cleared his throat. "Your mother's right, Vanessa. While this might be historically interesting, it's hardly relevant to our current standing. The Wellingtons have been pillars of Atlanta society for 3 generations now. That's what matters." "What matters," Vanessa countered, her voice steady, "is truth, authenticity, and using the privileges we've inherited, privileges that exist because of Grandmother Eliza's work as a domestic employee, to create opportunities for others following similar paths." She went on to outline her plans for the Foundation's new focus on supporting domestic workers pursuing education. Catherine's expression shifted from rigid disapproval to something more complex. discomfort mingled with reluctant recognition. "And there's one more thing," Vanessa concluded. "I've decided to return to school myself. I've been accepted to Emory's accelerated nursing program, starting next semester." The silence that followed this announcement was profound. Catherine stared at her daughter as if seeing a stranger. Jeffrey's brow furrowed in confusion. "Nursing?" Catherine finally managed. "But your position at the art museum, your board seats, everything we've built for you." "Everything you've built for an idea of who I should be," Vanessa corrected gently. "Not for who I actually am." I watched this exchange with quiet admiration for Vanessa's composed certainty, for her ability to speak her truth without aggression or defensiveness. Richard's hand found mine under the table, squeezing it slightly in shared recognition of the courage we were witnessing. The conversation that followed was difficult, moments of tension and incomprehension interspersed with glimpses of potential acceptance. Catherine struggled visibly with the implications of Vanessa's revelations, not just for her daughter's future, but for her own understanding of her family's history. It was Jeffrey who surprisingly shifted first. "Your grandmother, Eliza, was a remarkable woman," he said during a pause in the increasingly circular arguments. "I only met her a few times before she passed, but I remember being struck by her dignity, her quiet intelligence. If she began as a domestic worker, that only makes her accomplishments more impressive, not less." Catherine turned to her husband, with something like betrayal in her expression. "Jeffrey, you can't possibly be encouraging this rejection of everything we've built." "It's not rejection, Mother," Vanessa said softly. "It's reclamation of grandmother's true legacy, of my authentic path. I'm not turning away from our family. I'm connecting with it more deeply than ever before, just without the artificial constraints we've imposed." As the dinner progressed through its carefully orchestrated courses, I observed the subtle shifts in Catherine's demeanor, from rigid rejection to reluctant consideration, from defensive pride to tentative curiosity. By dessert, she was asking cautious questions about the nursing program, about Vanessa's vision for the foundation's new direction. Not acceptance yet, not fully, but openness to possibility. The beginning of a conversation, rather than the end of one. As we prepared to leave, Catherine drew me aside for a moment. "You've had something to do with this transformation in my daughter, haven't you?" she asked, her tone not accusatory but thoughtful. "Vanessa's journey is entirely her own," I replied honestly. "I've simply been privileged to witness it." Catherine studied me with the same penetrating gaze her daughter sometimes employed. "When you were caring for me after my hospitalization, you mentioned that before becoming a nurse, you had worked as a housekeeper." I nodded, curious where this observation was leading. "I didn't quite grasp the significance then," she continued, "but I find myself wondering now. Did you recognize something in Vanessa that the rest of us missed? Some potential beneath the carefully constructed surface?" The question revealed a self-awareness I hadn't expected from Catherine Spencer, an acknowledgement that her daughter had indeed been performing a role rather than living authentically, and that perhaps others had noticed what her own proximity had obscured. "I recognize something universal," I said carefully. "The longing to align our outer lives with our inner truths. Vanessa is extraordinarily fortunate to have found the courage to pursue that alignment before spending decades in a life that doesn't reflect her authentic values." Catherine absorbed this, nodding slowly. "I'm not sure I understand the choices she's making, but I do understand courage, and my daughter has certainly demonstrated that quality, however misguided I may find her current direction." It wasn't a ringing endorsement, but it was a beginning, a crack in the rigid framework of expectations that had constrained both mother and daughter for so long. As we drove home that evening, Vanessa sighed deeply from the back seat where she sat beside Richard. That was even harder than I anticipated, but also freeing. For the first time in my life, I've spoken my complete truth to my parents, regardless of their ability to accept it. That kind of honesty is a gift, I said, turning slightly to meet her eyes, even when it's initially experienced as disruption. She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes in a way her practiced social smiles never had. I keep thinking about those empanadas we made together, Carmen. How the process requires patience, attention to detail, honoring tradition while still allowing for personal interpretation. It feels like a metaphor for the life I'm trying to build. Now, one ingredient, one careful fold at a time. The image struck me as beautifully apt. Life, like cooking, is both science and art, requiring fundamentals while allowing for creative expression, honoring heritage while making room for innovation, demanding precision while forgiving imperfection. What had begun with Vanessa's rejection of food made in a housekeeper's kitchen had evolved into a profound reconsideration of value, dignity, and authenticity. The journey wasn't complete, such journeys never truly are, but the direction was unmistakable, the momentum established. As we arrived at Richard and Vanessa's building, she turned to me once more. Next Sunday at our place, I'll make the empanadas this time. I wouldn't miss it, I assured her, recognizing the invitation as more than just a social engagement. It was a commitment to continuing this newfound connection, to nurturing the authentic relationship that had begun to flourish between us. Some transformations appear sudden, but are actually the culmination of forces long at work beneath the surface. Vanessa's month-long journey from rejection to tearful recognition reflected this truth, a rapid-seeming metamorphosis that actually represented the emergence of her authentic self after years of careful constraint. As I drove home alone, I reflected on the extraordinary privilege of witnessing such profound change, of being present as someone finds the courage to align their life with their deepest values, regardless of external pressures or expectations. It reminded me why I had loved nursing for so many years, the honor of accompanying people through their most vulnerable, transformative moments, offering not judgment, but presence, not direction, but witness. Life continuously offers us opportunities to expand our understanding, to evolve our perspectives, to deepen our connections with others. The wisdom lies in recognizing these opportunities when they appear, even when they initially arrive disguised, as rejection, conflict, or uncomfortable truth. For Vanessa and for me, what had begun as mutual misunderstanding had blossomed into genuine connection, a reminder that our most meaningful relationships often grow from challenging beginnings, if we bring courage, honesty, and openness to the journey. 3 months passed with remarkable swiftness. Spring surrendered to Atlanta's sweltering summer. My garden bloomed with vibrant colors, and the transformation in Vanessa continued to unfold in ways both subtle and profound. She had begun her accelerated nursing program at Emory with the same dedication she had once applied to managing charity galas and museum board meetings. But there was a difference in how she approached this new challenge, a humility and openness I hadn't seen in her before, a willingness to acknowledge uncertainty without seeing it as weakness. Our Sunday dinners had become a cherished tradition, sometimes at my home, sometimes at their penthouse, occasionally joined by Richard's colleagues or my friends from the hospital, but always centered around cooking together. Vanessa had progressed from empanadas to more complex Colombian dishes, approaching each recipe with serious concentration and genuine respect for the techniques passed down through generations of my family. On this particular Sunday, in late July, we were gathered in my kitchen preparing a special meal. Luisa had accepted our invitation to join us, a breakthrough that had taken weeks of gentle encouragement. Despite the friendship that had developed between us, she had initially been reluctant to cross the social boundary between employee and family friend. "It doesn't feel appropriate," she had explained when Vanessa first extended the invitation. I've worked for your parents for 20 years, to suddenly sit at your table as a guest. But Vanessa had persisted with genuine determination. That's exactly why it matters, she had told Louisa. To acknowledge that we can be both, that your role in my parents' home doesn't define the entirety of who you are, or how we might connect as people who share a heritage and history. Now Louisa stood beside me at the counter, expertly slicing plantains for patacones, while Vanessa prepared the hogao sauce, her movements growing more confident with each passing week of practice. Richard and Miguel, Louisa's son, were deep in conversation on the patio, their engineering backgrounds creating an immediate connection despite their different paths to professional success. Your daughter-in-law has changed, Louisa observed quietly in Spanish, nodding toward Vanessa, who was focused intently on adjusting the seasoning in her sauce. She carries herself differently now. Yes, I agreed. She's growing into herself rather than trying to maintain an image imposed by others. It reminds me of my own journey when I first came to this country, Louisa continued. That period of questioning everything you thought you knew about yourself, rebuilding your identity from the foundation up. The parallel struck me as insightful. Though their circumstances had been vastly different, both women had experienced a fundamental disruption to their established sense of self. For Louisa, it had been geographic displacement and the transition from respected teacher to domestic worker. For Vanessa, it had been the internal displacement that comes from discovering your family narrative, and by extension, your own life story, was built on carefully constructed myths. Her nursing instructors say she has a natural affinity for patient care, I shared, especially with the elderly. Something about her presence puts them at ease. The revelation about Vanessa's talent had surprised me initially. Given her previous discomfort with vulnerability and mess, both inevitable aspects of healthcare, I had privately wondered if she would struggle with the practical realities of nursing. But her instructors reported quite the opposite. Once, freed from the constraint of maintaining perfect composure, Vanessa had discovered a remarkable capacity for empathetic presence amid suffering. I can see that, Louisa nodded thoughtfully. She's learning to listen differently, to see people, rather than just their circumstances or position. Our conversation paused as the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of our final guests. Richard went to answer it, returning moments later with Catherine and Jeffrey Spencer. Their presence at our gathering represented perhaps the most unexpected development of the past 3 months. After the tense dinner where Vanessa had revealed her discoveries and decisions, I had assumed Catherine would maintain polite distance, attending obligatory family functions, but otherwise withdrawing in silent disapproval. Instead, something more complex had emerged, a cautious, halting, but persistent effort to understand her daughter's transformation. It hadn't been smooth or immediate. There had been difficult conversations, tearful confrontations, periods of strained silence. But Catherine had surprised us all with her eventual willingness to examine her own assumptions, not just about her family history, but about the values she had unquestioningly prioritized throughout her life. Carmen, she greeted me with a warmth that still felt slightly practiced but increasingly genuine. Something smells wonderful. Colombian comfort food, I explained, accepting the bottle of wine Jeffrey offered. Vanessa has been mastering my mother's recipes. Catherine's gaze moved to her daughter, who had looked up from her cooking to welcome her parents. There was something in that gaze I had come to recognize over these months, a mixture of lingering bewilderment and growing admiration. Catherine still didn't fully understand the path Vanessa had chosen, but she was beginning to respect the courage it required. "Mother, I'm so glad you could come," Vanessa said, wiping her hands on her apron, another sight that would have been unimaginable just months ago. "I want you to meet someone special." She turned to Louisa, who had straightened. Slightly at the Spencers' arrival, her professional demeanor automatically reasserting itself. This is Luisa Mendez. She's been kind enough to share additional Colombian recipes with us, expanding on Carmen's repertoire. The introduction was deliberate in its completeness. No mention of Luisa's employment relationship with the Spencer family, no qualifying her presence through her function. Just acknowledgement of her as an individual with valuable knowledge to share. Catherine hesitated only briefly before extending her hand. Ms. Mendez, how lovely to meet you in this context. I understand your son recently graduated from Georgia Tech? Jeffrey is on their engineering advisory board. It was a small moment, but significant in its implications. Catherine making an effort to acknowledge Luisa's identity beyond her role in their household. Recognizing her pride as a parent. Establishing a connection through something other than employment. Not revolutionary, perhaps, but evolutionary. A step toward seeing more completely, toward recognizing the full humanity in someone previously defined by their function. As we moved through the preparations for our meal, I observed the shifting dynamics with quiet appreciation. Jeffrey engaged Miguel in a substantive conversation about emerging technologies in civil engineering. Richard and Luisa discovered a shared passion for classical music. Vanessa moved between kitchen and dining room with a natural ease I had never seen in her before, comfortable in her own skin, no longer performing competence but simply embodying it. When we finally gathered around the table, my simple dining room transformed by Vanessa's artistic arrangement of wildflowers from my garden, Catherine surprised us with an announcement. I've been doing some research of my own, she said as we passed dishes family style, another departure from the formal service that would have been her preference months ago. About Eliza, my mother. Vanessa looked up with evident interest. What kind of research? I found her journals from before she met my father, Catherine said, her voice carrying an unusual hesitancy. They were in a trunk in the attic of our summer house in Savannah. I never paid attention to them before, just old books with faded writing. But after your revelations, Vanessa, I felt compelled to read them. We waited as Catherine collected her thoughts, the usual dinner conversations suspended in recognition of the significance of this moment. She wrote extensively about her work in the Harrington household, Catherine continued. Not just the physical tasks, but her observations about the family dynamics, the community connections, the social hierarchies she navigated. She was remarkably insightful. Almost anthropological in her documentation of a world she moved through but wasn't considered part of. That must have been fascinating to discover, I offered when Catherine paused. Illuminating, she agreed, and humbling. The woman in those journals was not the mother I knew, or thought I knew. She was younger, of course, but also more radical in her thinking, questioning conventions I've spent my life upholding. People evolve, Vanessa suggested gently. Perhaps grandmother adapted to her new social position once she married into the Wellington family. Found it easier to conform than to constantly challenge expectations. The observation carried no judgment, but Catherine winced slightly. Perhaps recognizing the parallel to her own life choices. Perhaps, she acknowledged. But I've been wondering lately how much was lost in that adaptation. For her, and subsequently for me. She looked directly at her daughter. And what I may have unintentionally asked you to sacrifice by insisting you follow a similarly prescribed path. The admission seemed to cost Catherine significant effort, her usual composure cracking to reveal genuine regret. Vanessa reached across the table to cover her mother's hand with her own. We can only make choices with the understanding we have at any given moment, she said. You wanted what you believed was best for me, based on your own experience and the values you'd been taught to prioritize. Values I'm beginning to question, Catherine admitted quietly. Jeffrey looked at his wife with an expression of surprised respect, as if seeing a dimension of her he hadn't fully appreciated before. Catherine has been meeting with the board of the Wellington Foundation, he explained to the rest of us, discussing potential new directions for their philanthropic focus. What kind of new directions? Richard asked. Educational support. For domestic workers and their families, Catherine said, a hint of her usual decisiveness returning to her voice. Vanessa's initiative through your foundation inspired me to examine how our family's primary charitable entity might evolve to better reflect, well, our complete heritage. The significance of this shift wasn't lost on anyone at the table. The Wellington Foundation had traditionally focused on arts endowments, historical preservation, and other typically elite philanthropic interests. Redirecting even a portion of those resources towards supporting domestic workers represented a profound acknowledgement of Eliza's legacy and the values evident in her early journals. That's wonderful, Mother, Vanessa said warmly. Perhaps we could coordinate our efforts, create complementary programs rather than duplicate services. I was hoping you'd say that, Catherine replied. Your expertise from developing your own initiative would be invaluable as we reshape ours. As the conversation continued, exploring possibilities for collaboration between the two foundations, I caught Luisa's eye across the table. She offered a small, private smile that communicated volumes, acknowledgement of the remarkable evolution we were witnessing, appreciation for being included as a participant, rather than merely a topic of discussion. Later, as we enjoyed coffee, and the fruit tart Vanessa had prepared for dessert, Miguel shared news of his recent promotion at the engineering firm. I'll be managing the new infrastructure project downtown, he explained with evident pride. The same buildings I used to stare up at as a kid while waiting for the bus with my mother. Cycles completing themselves, I observed. Your mother's sacrifices creating opportunities that allow you to reshape the very landscape of the city she navigated as a newcomer. That's a beautiful way to frame it, Vanessa said thoughtfully. I've been thinking a lot about cycles lately. How we return to essential truths, sometimes generations later. How understanding where we come from can clarify where we're meant to go. Catherine studied her daughter with that mixture of bewilderment and admiration I had come to recognize. You've found a certainty I never expected, she said. Not the certainty of someone following a prescribed path, but something deeper, something earned rather than inherited. I'm not certain about everything, Vanessa admitted with a candor that would have been unthinkable for her former self. I still question my decisions sometimes, still worry about disappointing people whose opinion I value. But I'm learning to distinguish between external validation and internal resonance, to recognize when something feels right because it aligns with my authentic values, not because it meets others' expectations. Jeffrey raised his glass in an impromptu toast. To authenticity, then, and to the courage it requires. As we clinked glasses, I reflected on the extraordinary journey we had all undertaken over these past months. What had begun with Vanessa's rejection of food prepared in a housekeeper's kitchen had evolved into this moment of genuine connection across differences of culture, class, and generation. Not perfect understanding, that remains an aspiration rather than an achievement for most of us, but authentic engagement with one another's humanity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.